In this episode, we're on a quest to find the Holy Grail and how it's been depicted in pop culture history. Join us as we look at Monty Python, Indiana Jones, and beyond. Here we go. Welcome to another episode of Paranormal Popcast. I am Nick.
And I'm Vin.
And we are here today to talk about the Holy Grail. We are on a quest to find out how it is depicted in pop culture, from movies to novels and other wonderful, wonderful pop culture media. So, Vin, when we think about the Holy Grail, obviously this is we're talking about supernatural things and paranormal things on this podcast. So I'm going to delve a little bit into like the history of how it's, people who really try to think it really exists and it's out there. But it's come into like the nomenclature of popular culture where people just hear that phrase, Holy Grail, and it's come to represent this kind of quest, this maybe thing that you can obtain, but you're obsessed with going after it, like maybe Captain Ahab with Moby Dick, just right. Constantly looking for it. So, when you hear the phrase, what comes to mind for you?
I think, interestingly enough, I think the first thing that comes to mind, which does come into the idea of a quest, I think of the Knights Templar a lot. Like that's sort of that image of the Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, King Arthur.
Yep.
But a lot of the pop culture stuff, as you know, comes into that pseudoscience, pseudo-reality, TV shows and things like that. And there's a lot of speculation in terms of, is the Holy Grail real? Did the Knights Templar have it? So they've been leaning a lot into that storyline. So that's what comes to me initially.
Yeah, and it's this kind of supernatural elements that have been adding to it in pop culture, that it gives you eternal life. So it's kind of like the fountain of youth if you can find it. And maybe gives you powers or things like that. So that's something that I think made it a good fit for us to kind of explore. And I guess it does fall. There's a whole genre of this, right? Because you have like the Ark of the Covenant. I was using Raiders of the Lost Ark and other things. And you've got the Spear of Destiny, which is kind of a similar thing, with people who possess it suddenly have power, right? So all these religious icons have been incorporated into popular culture storytelling. Whereas in the past, before that, I guess you look at fairy tales and things, there are objects and things that people search for. And since the, Tolkien and others, you've got the ring, and you have other things that have power. And there's no real explanation of how it obtained that power, right, in some of those things. But here you take something that's in this kind of religious lore, and you take it now and add it into the supernatural, paranormal, science fiction. Are there others that come to mind that might fall into that genre?
I think in terms of the Holy Grail, I think you're right with the Ark of the Covenant, magical swords.
Yeah.
When you magical rings, if you bring up the Lord of the Rings, they're all sort of magical artifacts.
Yeah.
And I think when you have something real, at least in terms of it's a physical object, that enhances sort of the acceptance of that this could have some magical powers. A lot of it goes to myth, and humans, obviously throughout history, as long as humans have been around, have been attracted to the mythic. I think in our contemporary times, with a lot of information out there, a lot of science, right, where sort of dispels the mythic, we're still looking for the mythic.
Right.
And so you pull from religion, things that are relatable, things that are easily grasped and easily imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have, again, this chalice that, of course, is associated with iconic isn't even like the right word for it, but associated with Jesus, which Christianity touches, so many people in the world. Making those connections is what brings it into the realm of, let's write a story about this,
Right.
And let's speculate about it, because this is all speculative fiction. In terms of, like we said, Raiders of the Lost Ark or some of these other pop culture movies and books and things like that. But I think the idea of the connection, getting a connection to something that's real to people, is what makes it appealing.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue then to go into doing a little bit of history about this, to kind of ground us into where this whole trope came from history, right? Because like you said, you can just come up with something like this magical sword or magical stone, which through a lot of mythology and fairy tales, that's part of what's been driving people on these quests, the hero's journey, right? But there allegedly was this this Holy Grail, right? That through the Middle Ages, I think, is when it really spiked in terms of becoming a storytelling tool. But those of you who don't know the history but have heard Holy Grail, right? It's supposed to be the chalice that Jesus used at the Last Supper. Right. So the Last Supper is this iconic too, in terms of the paintings and things in art, right? Da Vinci has used it. Jesus, you picture him and his disciples sitting around the table having that Last Supper, and it was that chalice that became part of that major story, right? That Christians believe, right? And then, according to myth, according to the Holy Grail storyline, Joseph of Arimathea, who is the one of the followers of Jesus and gave the tomb for Jesus, took that chalice and actually captured some of the blood of Christ, right? So it follows into what Jesus was saying at the Last Supper, plus then this, what happened to that chalice, right? And you would look back and be like, okay, it would just disappear. It's just a cup, right? But you have to look at historically, especially around 300 AD. That's when people were really getting into these religious icons, these relics. So they were looking for bones of saints. They were looking for the true cross. So you had Saint Helena, who was the mother of Constantine the Great, was trying to find where was that cross that Jesus was crucified on, and went on this quest to find it. And then the story goes that she found it, and she brought it back to Rome, and it became this kind of religious sacred icon, right? And then people had splinters of it, and there's so many pieces of wood that are out there that are allegedly part of that true cross, that if you gather them all together, it would make something like the size of a mountain or something, But that became, this kind of lore where people were just so looking to grab something, right? That was, like you mentioned it before, something tangible, something physical, where you're like, Jesus touched this, or one of the saints touched this, or this is an actual bone from St. Peter or from one of these other. So that became this whole part of tradition. And I guess the Holy Grail itself goes into, then, you mentioned the Knights Templar. So during the Crusades, you had these group of knights, and according to lore and what we've been hearing, like, part of it was finding the Holy Grail, finding this chalice, and then protecting it. So there's stories that maybe they did find it, these Knights Templar, and they brought it somewhere. So in history, there's like all these places that allege to actually have the real Holy Grail, Right. So it's anything you want to add to that, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what you just said in terms of getting the stories that came about getting these artifacts and collecting these relics, brought to mind the notion that I think a lot of these artifacts and relics are, we want to affirm our own faith. That's why you see something like this. There's a piece of all of these kind of supernatural things that we watch because we want to believe that they're real. We want to affirm these things we believe on a faith level, right? So whether you're Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, any religion, or you believe in the afterlife, or you want to believe that there's something beyond what we have here, you instinctively look for those relics. So, or that proof that what you believe is actually real. You're looking for that evidence. And what you mentioned, those stories, I think, sort of shined a light on that. That's why the Holy Grail becomes something to look for, because it is something that's been passed along throughout history in the form of stories, and it keeps popping up. It popped up, like you said, the Knights Templar. It pops up with, in stories now, but even after the Knights Templar, like you mentioned, some people believed it was the Fountain of Youth, and that's the Holy Grail. And going again to take it a step further, the relic becomes representative of something else, too. So in the effort to prove the existence of a relic, you begin to speculate that, well, maybe the relic doesn't exist exactly as a chalice. This relic exists as a fountain of youth or hope or faith or whatever it is. And that perpetuates it in popular culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess you wouldn't really call it popular culture back then, but
right.
It really started being used in storytelling. So you had this poem by, and I'm going to butcher the name, this French poet. I'm just going to say it, Chrétien de Troyes, I guess, but it's called Percival. And it was this epic poem that was unfinished by him. And others then added more to it. But Percival was a knight. And searching for the Holy Grail. So the Holy Grail became the core part of this story about Percival, right? And then you had, so that was the 12th century, and then you had the whole King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table storylines. Right. So up until now, so many people are saying, was there someone named King Arthur? Was there an actual Arthur in history? And maybe there was, and maybe that's part of where some of the lore came from. So there's probably some, just of all the fairy tales and everything, there's probably some grain of truth in there. But the Holy Grail, did they ever really search for it, these Knights of the Round Table? Well, we know that the Knights Templar existed. There were these knights that existed. And the Holy Grail story has been attached to them. So maybe there is some kind of truth, because we know, like we said before, a lot of people those early centuries were looking for these relics, and it gave them hope. And then you had the Crusades at that time, so there was war, and they were fighting over faith and over land and over, tradition and territory, and I guess using these kinds of icons to either motivate people or, motivate themselves, or maybe, like you said, to represent something else in the search of what you're looking for, or to prove yourself. Are we worthy enough to find this? Because in the story of the King Arthur, I think there's only one of the knights who actually found it. Was it Galahad? I think Sir Galahad, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it becomes representative of something else.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that, given that we know the Holy Grail was in the public consciousness. Mm-hmm. Whether in a form of speculation or simply as a strong religious belief, it's hard to imagine that they weren't looking for it. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think those stories of King Arthur in particular, and the Knights Templar, which was a secretive kind of society, or maybe that even developed, as in the game of telephone, as stories became stories became stories. But I think there had to be a shred of truth to that. How much of it, you don't know, because like I said, it becomes a game of telephone, and once you get into the age of mass media, which from with your Percival here, or Percival 1904, that's right when mass media starts. And then really I think the stories take on a life of their own after that.
Right. And that's where I guess we can pick up this whole pop culture moment, where we can start calling it pop culture, because it's stories for the masses in the modern media that we know. So the birth of film, right? It was still the silent era, 1904, I guess. Thomas Edison was one of those early pioneers of film, and one of his first silent movies that his studio made was Percival, which was based on an opera by Richard Wagner, and it was in 1882. So that was I guess the first depiction in film of something that was about the Holy Grail. Had you heard of it? Had you heard anything about it?
No, this is the first time I've heard of that movie. Certainly a 1904 silent film.
Yeah.
No, I had not heard of this before.
And a silent movie about an opera. How do they pull that off? But back then, you had to think about it. Like they would show these silent movies, and then they would have live orchestras and live musicians doing a score. So they must have been playing some of the operatic songs. And as I did my research, I heard that the estate of Wagner, was trying to sue Thomas Edison because they didn't have permission, So it was like, this whole thing where it's like it's a new novelty. Movies were new, like they didn't go out and get permission sometimes for some of these adaptations, but they were looking for content, and that's the story right there. And
it's
apparently,
like YouTube.
Exactly. and
they give them a copyright strike.
There you go. And then they apparently they've remade this in 1912. They did Percival, and there was a German version. It makes sense because with the Wagner, and I'm sure they got some. It was public domain by then, so nobody had to worry about. But they did a movie, I think, in the Parsifal, 1982, West German and French collaboration. Then there was other things I looked up. The Silver Chalice novel from 1952, and that was about a Roman slave who is forced into creating the silver chalice. Because again, think about the cup of a carpenter would be very simplistic, and that's something that Indiana Jones goes into. So when we look at pop culture and what we think about nowadays, right, with movies and television, the one that really comes to mind is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Right, that's the one that really comes to mind. There were other things before, like the Silver Chalice was a novel in the 50s, and that was made into a Paul Newman movie. I haven't seen that one. There was something called The Holy Mountain. I don't know if it specifically talks about the Holy Grail, but it's just kind of might fall into that genre of what we were talking about at the beginning. But Monty Python and the Holy Grail is right there in the title, right? And when I think about that movie, I never really thought about the Holy Grail. It's just a bunch of vignettes, really funny moments, right? But there's that great, what you think of Monty Python, those animated segments, right?
Right.
There's that moment when it's like the Grail in the sun, right? And it's what, in the King Arthur legends, that's how King Arthur and the knights were called upon to follow this quest and to find the Grail, right? They saw a vision of the Grail, and then they went on their expedition and their journey and all their other adventures. Kind of, it was the MacGuffin of its time, right? This is what's going to lead you to all these side journeys and side adventures. And
I think with Monty Python and the Holy Grail, I think, and I don't know this to be true, but it just sort of came to mind now. You're
Yeah.
looking at, now you have here the exact year of this, right? 1975, right? So this is when Lord of the Rings
Yep.
as a book was sort of at its height, like that whole 60s and 70s hippie movement. Lord of the Rings was a big part of that. And Monty Python and the Holy Grail is a quest movie, right? So were they looking to do simply a quest movie? And what better story to do it or quest to have would be the Holy Grail, because I think they're not really similarities to the Lord of the Rings, but I think the idea of that quest and traveling, through medieval times on some big quest was probably a big part
Absolutely. Yeah.
of popular culture back then. Really, the 1975 was
Yep.
when Lucas was making Star Wars. Again, Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. So Monty Python, of course, they were, like you said, they were just making a string of, comedic,
Yeah.
absurdist skits, but they threaded it together with the quest movie.
Yeah.
And in this case, the Holy Grail was the MacGuffin. And I think you start to see some of that come into the Holy Grail as a MacGuffin, maybe after Monty Python. You see more of that. I'm not sure, but I don't know that.
Yeah. And those of you who are hearing this, like MacGuffin is that term that Alfred Hitchcock really made popular. It's that element of the story that the hero or the protagonist is searching for, or it's driving the action of the story. It doesn't have to mean anything. So it could be some microfiche film that the spy is going after, or it could be other things. But it doesn't really matter what it is. It's just something that is driving the story forward, and that is what leads these knights on all these adventures, right? Because they're searching for this thing, and I think another thing with the Monty Python is very British, right? So the story of King Arthur and the knights, that's part of. So I'm curious if, as Americans, we see it as so referential as maybe the Brits might have seen it, and then that's taking the humor and how they just totally turn it into a farce and just make fun of it. I think that adds a
Yeah.
lot to it too. That you mentioned the 1960s, that kind of counterculture movement where people are laughing at these things, laughing at these institutions
Right.
and all this myth, and treating it so irrelevantly, kind of, but that's part of the jokes and the humor. It really resonates. I thought it's one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. you know
Yeah. Well, and really, now that you mention it, Britain and England and Ireland was really steeped in a lot of religious strife for a lot of their history. So again, to take the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail was the Holy Grail, right? You know what I mean? And just sort of turn it into this absurdist movie was, I think, very relevant for that time, because, like you said, there was this very strong counterculture to the institutions at the time. And again, in America, maybe we didn't really get how relevant it was within the United Kingdom, rather than it was relevant in America too, but I don't think, we were just watching it for laughs. I mean, you and I were kids, but, my parents thought it was hilarious too. I mean, who didn't? So,
And then Terry Gilliam went on to make another Grail movie, The Fisher King, in 1991. A little bit more serious, not meant to be like this kind of comedy, but it had Robin Williams,
oh,
who was a very comedic actor, And this was one of those roles where I thought, he came across as very serious before he won, the Oscar and other things. Did you ever see Fisher King?
I saw it a long time ago, I think. I unfortunately don't have a big recollection of
Yeah,
it.
I mean, I haven't seen it since I first saw it in the movie theater back in the '90s. So my recollection of it isn't, I didn't. It wasn't one of the ones that was on my list to watch. And then as I was doing research, I was like, oh, the Fisher King, of course. And in part, the name itself, the Fisher King, is part of the lore of the Holy Grail. It's
Yeah,
supposed to be the person who's protecting the Grail. And in this story, this is set in modern times. Terry Gilliam directs it. It stars Jeff Bridges, I believe, and Robin Williams. Robin Williams is the standout. They're this. It's about this
yeah.
professor of lore, and then there's this person who's like a homeless person, and trying to find the Holy Grail or has the Holy Grail. So that's the subtext, right? So you don't need to kind of know, is it a physical grail, like, and I think the movie kind of makes it ambiguous, just like a lot of other Terry Gilliam films that he was doing later in his career. There's an ambiguity. What is the Holy Grail? It was more of a metaphor of today and what we're searching for. So a very unappreciated movie. Like, I think it's forgettable. Even we who saw it kind of like, oh yeah, Fisher King. I remember that movie,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know if it pops up in anybody's top 10 or anything, but it's definitely, I think, worth revisiting. I definitely want to check it out again in hindsight now, and just also see Robin Williams as one of those roles that I think people don't mention maybe when they think about his filmography. But I remember seeing it and being impressed with his performance and him bringing that to. So definitely one worth mentioning.
And you bring up an interesting point in that the Holy Grail in the Fisher King was ambiguous, and there seems to be, if we're talking about pop culture, there seems to be a transformation from the Holy Grail being something very, very real, is a physical object that we talked about earlier. But then as it moved through the pop culture machine, it has become a more ambiguous idea, and I think you'd find that probably in more recent times there's more, whether it's mentioned, I don't know, TV shows or things like that, there's sort of this, I think, more acceptance that the Holy Grail might be representative of something. And I think there's been a transformation
Yeah.
through popular culture
Yes.
past however many 50, 60, 70 years.
But that's a good segue to go into the whole Dan Brown story,
Right,
the Da Vinci Code, which takes that story element of it not being a physical cup,
right.
but it's representative of a cup. So it's based on actual research, which has been poo-pooed. A lot of people are like, is it real? Is it
Yes.
stretching? But there was a book, I think, called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. I think that was the name of
Mhm.
it. And that's what sparked Dan Brown to come up with this fictional story, this mystery.
Yeah, I think that
And
sounds
the
right.
MacGuffin in that is what is going on, and it's apparently the story about the Holy Grail wasn't a cup; it was Mary Magdalene, and all these there's this secret society throughout the centuries that's been covering it up.
Yeah,
But if you look at the artwork from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and all these clues are there that lead you to it, and maybe the Knights Templar were protecting the lineage of Mary Magdalene and Jesus and all this. And so it's this far-fetched storyline, right? But it's, again, for a story, the novel became a bestseller. The novel was like, made waves, and then the movie a few years later, Ron Howard directed it, right? I'm thinking, and of course it was Tom Hanks in the lead role as this great character, kind of like Indiana Jones, right? Going, because they had other novels after that where he's solving other crimes and going on other quests, but never reached the peak of Da Vinci Code. Da Vinci Code was like up there, and a lot of people with the movie, I remember his hairstyle made more of a buzz because it was the first time he really kind of had longish hair, so that was a little distracting. But I thought it was a decent movie. You remember seeing the movie?
I did. I watched it again recently. I was a little disappointed in it. I did read the book first, and I read it a long time ago. I think I remember watching it and thinking that the way it's presented in the movie doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I felt like, and it's sort of, I even read a review after I saw it that said it sort of played like, I don't know, almost like a textbook. Like it just like, went through like these things and, oh, this happens and this, figuring out stuff like, just almost, I guess, as an info dump. So from that perspective, I didn't really like the movie, but what I did watching it recall that I think the book just did the story better, which is not necessarily surprising. It does
Yeah.
both the book and the movie. I think, it captures that mystery. And I think the more ambiguous you make it, the more that mystery can be successful, right? Because when you try to make it real, and I don't know if I want to jump ahead with you, but the reality aspect of it in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is a little bit harder to accept, I think.
Because it was a physical object that they were going to see, going to find. And they found it.
And they found it, like that, right? So, it was sort of like this. And, Indiana Jones is, when you're watching it, when it's so like, it's such a period piece, happens during World War II or during, the time period. The more magical it gets, the harder it is to believe. So in that sense, I think Indiana Jones was a little bit different than the Da Vinci Code. Again, for the ambiguity that you mentioned, that the Da Vinci Code has, it lets you sort of, it gives you a little wiggle room in your suspension of disbelief.
And then when the movie came out, I think there was a lot of backlash for the novel a little bit because people were like, "Well, this is ridiculous. This is heresy. This is all the things that he wanted in the story because it sold books." And again, it was a good novel. But the movie, I remember, tried to play both sides a little bit. Like so they added things to the character that Tom Hanks played, Langston. I'm trying to remember what the character's name was. He was much more cynical, I think, in the movie.
Yeah.
Whereas in the book, I think he was
right.
kind of like he was, investigating, but
Yeah.
the story kind of the way he wrote it was like, this is the real deal, this is the truth, which made the story so powerful. Whereas in the movie, it was more about just a thriller element and like, okay, I guess that's what people are saying, but is it true or not? Who knows? It wasn't really important to the movie as much, and maybe that's why the movie wasn't as major ground changing as the novel.
Yeah, I can see how in making a movie you're going to reach more people, in a quicker whatever, and it's probably a little bit more risky to come out with an agenda, right? When you go into a movie, it's just any old person going to a movie to just again have fun and see see like an action adventure story of some sort. But when you get a book, like I know me, we're on this podcast, we're into these things, right? So I would choose that book to read and have some sort of more interest in being, say, convinced or just accepting that somebody is presenting this in a little bit more of a I guess, slanted way, right? Like has a little bit more of an agenda. I don't think you necessarily, if you're looking for that, you're really not going to choose to read this book. And I think that's an interesting thing when you're talking about pop culture is the different angles of the
Yeah.
same story depending on the medium you're presenting it in. And I think the Holy Grail is, when you're dealing with something that is religious rather than because even Raiders of the Lost Ark of the Covenant of Christianity, so there's a little bit more like a,
I'm glad you brought up the Ark of the Covenant again because that we mentioned it at the beginning. It is this kind of when you read about this in the Bible, which is the source of that story, it was this iconic thing for the nation of Israel at the time, right? Where they would bring it out to war, and it would help them in battle, unless they fell in disfavor with God or something, and then they would lose the battle, and then the Babylonians and others would steal the ark, right? And it would come back a couple of
right.
times, but it was supposed to hold like the Ten Commandments and a bowl of manna and the staff of Moses and things like that. So these again religious icons in this religious icon, right? But then it was lost, right? So during one of the major battles, it was lost,
Right.
and it kind of represented, I guess, for the Hebrew people, the kind of we are apart from God, and then in stories like Raiders of the Lost Ark, I think a good element of it is like seeing how these evil forces, like the Nazis, are trying to grab it to use its power, but then that subtext of the storytelling element where there's
Right.
danger in it too. So if you open it suddenly, that's where the melting face is and this power is unleashed. Are you worthy of the power, right? And I think you see that in stories like the Spear of
Yeah.
Destiny too, where people grab it because it's going to give them power to rule the world, but it's like these allegedly holy relics that give you power,
Hmm.
but it also brings you devastation and plagues and curses and all these other things, right? If you don't have a good intent for it. So that's why I think the second Indiana Jones movie, what were they searching for? It wasn't like this kind of known. It was the Temple of Doom, right? It was just like
Find
this
these
kind of
stones
MacGuffin.
that
Didn't
had
really have
power.
like much
Remember
of
that
me,
that
but it
was
was like
stolen.
that's what drove the plot. So that Indiana Jones would go through these
Yeah.
episodic adventures. And I think with the third movie, and people criticized that maybe it was kind of a rehash of Raiders of the Lost Ark. You just kind of substituted the Holy Grail for the Ark of the Covenant. A lot of the plot points, but having his father in it, Sean Connery played Indiana Jones's dad. I thought that kind of gave it this element of generational
Yeah.
storytelling, and the fact that mortality, Indiana Jones is getting older, so it could have been the Fountain of Youth instead of the Holy Grail, like they were searching. I think that might have maybe made a little bit more storytelling sense.
Right.
But the whole point of the story was if you find the Grail, right, it's going to give you eternal life. And the enemies are searching for it, and Indiana Jones has to find it before they do. And, I thought it's one of my favorite movies. I really liked it. And I kind of, at the end, they go off into the sunset, so I kind of wish they had ended it right there. You had two more Indiana Jones movies.
Yeah.
But, I thought they handled it well for the story, and then
Hmm.
they made it where it's like when you find it, you find a knight. Spoiler alert, right? And he has to choose. There's all these chalices, right? So just like in reality, where like if allegedly some of these places that have the Holy Grail, they think it's the real deal. So there's Valencia, Spain. There's Italy in Genoa. They say they have the Holy Grail. There's places in France that claim to have it. Places in England that claim to have it. So
Yeah.
which one is the true one? And if someone, some of these places believe that that's the true one, so is that in itself enough to just believe, even if it's not the real deal? And then, of course, the twist is he finds the one that's kind of like the most simple, it's not ornate, it's not decorated. So there is like some of these chalices, Valencia, the one that's a simple kind of agate stone, right? And it's covered with like gold because over the years, people who found it would kind of and I think that's the
Right.
premise of the Silver Chalice movie and novel, right? Where they make this Roman slave make this structure to hold the Grail, so it looks like this wonderful golden, you know, thing.
Hmm.
But what are your thoughts about Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade?
Well, I think you pointed out something interesting that I hadn't thought of before, in that having his father there did tie in very well with the notion of the Holy Grail. My feeling with just in the presentation of the Grail at the end, I like the idea, of course, that, and again, from an audience perspective, especially back then, the subverting of expectations, where it's like, oh no, it's this little cup, and that makes more sense, right? So Indiana Jones knew that it wasn't this really ornate thing, but it was a little bit, for me, a little bit too magical,
Right.
where he went through those trials, whatever, till he gets it, and then this knight is like a ghost or something. But again, that's just sort of
Mm-hmm.
for me, pulling me out of my suspension of disbelief. But not that I didn't like it, and I've watched the movie
Yeah.
even more recently, and almost every time I watch it, I like it more. Like, I think it was really well done. I think there's also an interesting element to The Last Crusade and senior
Hen.
pop Sean Connery. I'll just call him Sean Connery. Um, but was his obsession with it, and I think, again, there's, I'm not sure how far to take that concept, but again, looking at other artifacts, whether you talk about a magical sword, the ring in Lord of the Rings, of course, was an addiction because of the evil embedded in it, and things like that. But um, a lot of these relics that are used as MacGuffins or anything like that, I don't know that we see like this sort of obsession with it. And I think that spoke to the nature of the
Right.
Grail and the nature of thinking this is eternal life, right? The fountain of youth. That's, and again, I'm making some connections as we move along. Like, the Holy Grail in
Right.
Christianity is representative
Mm-hmm.
of eternal life. And so that connects it to the fountain of youth. And all of us, as living creatures who will one day die, are, in some sense, I guess, obsessed with this idea: is there life after death, or can there be eternal life? Um, so I think, in terms of what they chose in that movie, choosing the Holy Grail, it wasn't just a MacGuffin.
So key to the story, and they touch on all those elements. I think you mentioned MacGuffin, and we mentioned that's
Yeah.
that element that Hitchcock talked about. This drives the story along, and it would be remiss of me not to the theory for the Pulp Fiction, right? The story. Those of you who haven't seen Pulp Fiction, it's a Quentin Tarantino movie. It's about gangsters and about things like that. But one of the story elements is this briefcase that they have to get for Marcellus Wallace, right? And you never know what's in the briefcase. There's that moment when they open
Hmm.
it and there's just this like gold radiance. So there's been theories that it's the soul of Marcellus Wallace or it's things like that. But I've always said, I hear the theory that it's the Holy Grail because there's that moment when he's like, the character says, "Is that what I think it is?" So it's something recognizable. So I think if you open it up and you see a golden chalice that's radiating, right? You're like, whoa, is that the Holy Grail? What is? So that's my theory. I think the MacGuffin in Pulp Fiction is the Holy Grail. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts is Quentin Tarantino's playing a little bit of a trick on us, you know, and it's what's inside this briefcase is a MacGuffin, right? Like he's just, he doesn't know.
Of course, yeah.
It was just because I mean he's such a film geek, right? You know what I mean? And so I imagine he knows what a MacGuffin is.
Yeah.
And and the movie is called Pulp Fiction. So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a an inside joke of I'm gonna put a MacGuffin in here and it's just gonna be a briefcase that nobody even knows what the MacGuffin is. It's just a briefcase. But I think again, I mean this is a pop culture I think characteristic or whatever you want to call it, is this idea that you filter what you see through your own experiences or thoughts or how or your perspective, and whether you're talking about the Holy Grail or other paranormal elements that we've been talking about, there's real value in just doing that and having the speculation and the interpretation of it. It's not like if you say, I think this is the Holy Grail, that's wrong. Quentin Tarantino is just playing a trick on you. I think it's about the experience of watching the film, and this MacGuffin, whether it doesn't matter what it is, but what you think it is your experience of the film.
Absolutely.
Which is, which is also kind of genius, I think, on his part.
But there have been a lot of other representations. So we only scratched the surface. I think just looking through, there was the Librarian, Curse of the Judas Chalice. That was on the Sci-Fi channel. I think one of the TV movies. There's this recent one on Peacock called Mrs. Davis, which I've been meaning to watch. It's about AI and this nun that's searching for God. It's supposed to be about the Holy Grail too in there. So there's a lot of it's going to pop up over and over again. And even when I was doing one of my story writing episodes back when I was younger, I came up with a story called The Lugat and the Holy Grail about vampires, because you think about blood and it's like so my whole premise was there's this vampire doesn't want to be a vampire, trying to find a cure, and then finds the Holy Grail, and that's what so that becomes like this whole MacGuffin leading the story along. So I think it could tie in so many ways with supernatural stories and things like that. So I'm curious to see if anybody will do like a definitive Holy Grail story or another adventure where people are hunting the Holy Grail. It'll be curious to see. Any final thoughts? Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that overall, through this conversation, the Holy Grail is just a really interesting element, or I don't want to say, I'll say it for the last time, MacGuffin, but it's a really interesting story element because it can be used in many different ways. I don't know that other types of artifacts or relics or story elements are quite as malleable as the Holy Grail, which makes it interesting and makes it something that I'm sure we'll keep seeing because there's probably always another angle to look at it from.
And can be possessed and can be transferred and moved. If it was something like just the Fountain of Youth, or some of these other cities or places that you're searching for, it's in a finite location, those things, and you find it and you're there. But something like the Holy Grail can be hidden. It could be possessed. It could be kept in somebody's shoebox. It's that kind of. It's a good story element.
That's true. Yeah, because again, going back to the Ark of the Covenant, you just can't, carry it around in your coat, right? Things like swords or weapons, spears, and things like that have a use. The ring, can be, I guess, a little bit more hidden and possessed. Yeah. But there's something about the cup and the chalice, which again is also a very common object.
For sure.
Too. So like, I think that all of that together creates.
Well, thank you, Vin. This has been a good conversation.
Compelling storytelling.
I hope all of you who are listening will watch some of those movies and read some of those stories that we mentioned. And if there's any that we didn't mention, or if you had seen some of those pop culture adaptations that I said I hadn't seen but I mentioned, add a comment, shoot us an email, and share this with anyone that you think might find it of interest. We're always looking to build our audience. So thank you again. This has been Nick and my friend Vin, and we will see you next time on Paranormal Popcast.